leading efforts to link the everyday realities of workers in the informal economy with policy and research agendas. Her work has focused on expanding access to social protection, improving workers' health and childcare, and ensuring grassroots voices shape policy decisions. Laura has published widely, including co-editing the volume Informal Workers and Social Contracts in the Global South. We are very happy to have you, Professor Alfers. Before she takes the floor, I would want to announce that we have interpretations, so kindly locate the globe button on the Zoom icon, the menu icon, and then select your preferred language. We have interpretation in French and English. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Esther, for that introduction. I'm coming to you from my hotel room in Southeast Asia, and I'm hoping the internet is going to hold up. But please shout if I'm glitching. So I'm going to share my presentation, and I'm going to try and speak slowly, which is not one of my strong points. But let's try. And let's start. So first of all, a big thank you to the GETSPA project team for inviting me to do this webinar. It's a great honor. And I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about the informal economy, and then I'll move on to social policy. And I'm never sure with a new audience how much anybody knows about the informal economy. So I think it's always safe to do a little bit of groundwork about who are Africa's workers in informal employment, and then answer the question of why they're important for social policy. So let's just start off with some data, because when WIEGO was started 30 years ago, there was no data on informal employment. And one of the things that we've worked really hard to do is to work with international organizations, the national statistical offices, to ensure that we do have some data. So this graph really shows what we call status in employment, right? So status in employment is really about, you know, it's whether you're an employee or you're self-employed. Comrade Oda, I see you're here. Comrade John, do you want to come in? Because I've just started. So if you want to start off the session properly, I can wait. You're on mute. Okay. I'll just carry on. So status in employment is the position that kind of tells us what position in the economic structure workers are in. And the thing about the informal economy is that it's quite heterogeneous, right? There's actually a lot of different statuses in employment. And that can also tell us about the vulnerability of the particular worker. So in Africa, you'll see that employers in the right-hand top quadrant are actually a very small group. This is from ILO data. They're a very small group. And employers are usually the best off of the workers in the informal economy. They are enterprise owners, they employ others. There's often a discourse about informal workers as tax evaders. If they are tax evaders, they are usually falling into this employer category, because this is one of the only categories in the informal economy where people even earn enough to fall into some tax brackets. In a place like South Africa, it's not the same everywhere, obviously. But you'll see that employees and own account workers are sort of important sectors, or important statuses in employment in Africa. And what you'll also notice, employees are in the top left-hand quadrant and own account workers beneath them. What you'll notice is that's quite different across sub-regions in Africa. So in Northern Africa and Southern Africa, you'll see a predominance of employees and less own account workers. So own account workers are self-employed workers who don't employ anybody else. They work on their own account. So a street vendor who's just working on their own to sell. But own account work is a much higher proportion of the informal economy in West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa. So it's also important to notice that difference, because they're different. We sometimes think of Africa as one place and the informal economy as one thing, but these regional differences, also sub-regional differences, are also really important to take into account. And then the final sort of category of informal worker is a contributing family worker. So these are often unpaid workers. They're contributing to the family business. And contributing family workers are everywhere, perhaps least in Southern Africa, as you'll see from the data. But what's really striking about contributing family workers, so the orange tabs are women and the green tabs are men. So this is sex disaggregated. You'll see that women vastly outnumber men. And this is the most vulnerable sector of the informal economy, right? So you just see this reality of the fact that women tend to be located in the most vulnerable sectors of the informal economy. And this is just really to confirm that gendered pattern, right? So men in green, women in orange. You'll see that in the vulnerable informal statuses, which is own account work and contributing family work, we'll see women are disproportionately represented. And so that means they disproportionately face higher risks and lower incomes in the informal economy. And so those are two facts about the informal economy that are important. There's these different statuses in employment. Not all informal workers have the same relationship to the economic structure around them. An employee is going to face different economic risks. The pathways to protection are going to look different. Say if you're a domestic worker with an employer, than it will for a self-employed street vendor working on the side of the road. There's just a whole different economic context in which they're operating in, and the policy sort of solutions are also going to be different. The other important sort of disaggregation to think about with the informal economy is age. So informal employment is a pretty large part of Africa's labor market. For everybody, over 80%. But you'll see that there are spikes in the youth, 15 to 24, but also for those above 65. And that when you get to prime working age, there's a bit more formality that comes in. I think there's been a lot of, there's a fair amount of discourse around youth employment and decent work for the youth, but we see less discourse around what decent work for those 65 plus might look like. I mean, obviously there's pensions and there's been a big push around social pensions. But some people, the pension isn't going to be enough and there might still need to be work. And that work is often done in the informal economy, and that should also be recognized. So I just wanted to start off with some of the data, because I think it's always important just in case people don't have that background. But let's get into the social policy side of things. So I did some background reading on GETSPA and read that part of the inspiration is the work of Thandika and Kandawire. And so I went back to look for some of his definitions of what social policy is, and found this quote, which I thought was interesting, where he outlines a sort of framework for thinking about what is social policy, focusing on redistribution, protection, production, and reproduction, and the idea that social policy can be used to transform social relations as important. So what I thought I would do is take that structure and use it as a framework around which to build this presentation, and to kind of overlay it over the informal economy. And what I did when I started doing that was realizing that actually the informal sector itself, or the informal economy itself, actually plays a lot of the roles of social policy in terms of being involved in redistribution, protection, production, and reproduction. And that actually wasn't the intention of the presentation, but it did become clear, and it's clear to me as I went on. And I think that poses the question to us, is if that is the case, if the informal economy is already playing this role, what can it tell us about how we can build social policy from the ground up? There's certainly been good advances in social policy on the continent. Social protection is one area, but there's still a lot of gaps. And I think the question is, how do we learn from what is happening already? What is problematic about what is happening already? Because not all of it is good necessarily. Not all of it is going to produce better outcomes for people. Not all of it is going to transform social relations, and we also have to be honest about that. So that's what I've tried to do with this presentation. So in the first part of the presentation, I'm going to try and look at the ways in which the informal economy is involved in redistribution, protection, and so on, and look at where some of the gaps in state policy are. And then in the second part of the presentation, I will speak to some of the debates, I think, that exist if we are to take inspiration from the ground up. So if we start with redistribution, so many informal workers are subsidizing households. Workers in the informal economy are subsidizing households via unpaid and low-paid care work. So domestic workers, for example, are in low-paid care work. They are helping people to do the domestic care work that they can't do because they are out working. But it's often very low-paid, very precarious work. And of course, we all know about women's unpaid care work as well. And often workers in the informal economy are balancing both, right? Especially women in these vulnerable occupations, like the contributing family workers are actually sort of crossing between the two domains. There is a kind of idea that workers in the informal economy don't pay tax, and so they're a bit of a drain on the public purse. But actually, a research project that we did with the University of Ghana's ISA showed that workers in the informal economy are often contributing to public revenues, and they're often doing it regressively. So they're often, poorer workers are paying more than people who are better off, or even formal workers. But they tend to be excluded from the protections that you would want to have in return for paying your tax. So they're cross-subsidizing others, basically. The redistribution is happening, but the redistribution is upwards, not downwards. And we also see formal enterprises benefiting from low-cost goods and services from workers in the informal economy, but leaving the risks with the informal workers, right? So yeah, there's some interesting sort of dynamics there around redistribution and how the informal economy. I was in South Africa, actually. There was a study a few years back trying to estimate, what are the economic benefits to the formal economy of the informal economy, because there are these backward linkages. The formal economy, the informal economy buys a lot of its produce from the formal economy in South Africa. So it actually is a market for the formal economy. The formal economy makes a lot of money off the informal economy. And this idea that they're separate is not always the case, is often not the case. So just to back that up with a bit of data as well, this is on the taxation front. So this was the WIEGO ISA and the ICTD informal taxation survey. This was a representative sample. It was a big piece of work to really look at what is happening in terms of paying taxes. So what we found is highly regressive, right? If you see the earning quintiles, the lowest earning quintiles are paying the highest percentage of their income to taxation. And this is because in many African countries, we have these presumptive simplified tax regimes where there's just a flat tax rate, which is levied on the informal workforce. And that naturally is going to end up with this kind of situation. So the lowest quintile are paying much more than the highest quintile, which is the lighter blocks, and that's not really what you want to see. Some of the new taxes that have been introduced are replicating this regressivity. So this study also captured, it was run at the time of the introduction of the e-levy that Ghana was introducing. And that showed that the poorest paid up to 8% of their net earnings through mobile money transactions. And that was despite the tax's intention to be progressive and to exclude the poorest from the tax net. I think one of the interesting findings from this piece of work as well was that visibility matters. So the workers who were more visible, the street traders, the market traders, were much more likely to be taxed. But there was still a pretty inequitable tax burden. And I think what's particularly worrying about the situation is that many of these enterprises who were sampled were sitting on the poverty line or below the poverty line, right? So we are taxing people at 10% who really can't afford to be taxed at 10%. And that is going into the state. And quite often informal workers will say, well, we actually wouldn't mind paying that as long as we saw some kind of service in return. And quite often they don't see that. I think as well, what was interesting about this study was the variation in the amounts being paid, and particularly again in the lowest quintiles. So you have men on the left and women on the right. And again, you'll see in the darkest blocks, which is the lowest quintile, you'll see the highest variation in the amounts of taxes paid. So some men in quintile 1, which is the lowest quintile, the people earning maybe 2,200 Ghana cedis a year, some of them were paying 47% of their income in taxes, market levies, fees, and so on. And for women, it was up to 50% in some cases. So that just shows you the money is going into the state's coffers and the public purse, but it's in the wrong direction. We want that to be the other way. We'd want the sort of high net worth individuals to be paying 50% of their income, not the people who are sitting on the poverty line. So let's look at protection. So I did say that there have been advances in sort of thinking through what social protection for workers in the informal economy in Africa could look like. I think there have been many innovations in terms of how we can adapt social security schemes for the self-employed. And I'd certainly want to recognize that. The actual problem with what I call an adverse incorporation of workers in the informal economy into social security schemes that are really just not going to provide them with significant protection. So the World Bank had, and this was mainly prior to COVID, but is I think still ongoing, was doing a big push to promote long-term savings schemes provided by the state, and calling that social protection, But effectively, when you're asking very poor people to put a little bit of money away every day into a savings scheme, that can be useful to them, but it isn't going to provide them with a pension. And so, we've been doing some study. We've just finished a study in Nigeria, actually, looking at the micro pension scheme that has been set up there, which is targeting the informal sector. And we worked with the Federation of Informal Workers of Nigeria to look at who of their members were actually contributing to this micro pension, and just calculating what those contributions would add up to over a 20 or 30-year period if you take into account the kind of inflation and those kinds of things. And really, people are going to have very little money at the end with the amount that they can contribute. So to say that is the kind of social protection that's going to give people meaningful protection is really problematic. It's not to say that long-term saving schemes aren't important, but to replace social protection with those is problematic. And again, we see this shifting of risk onto individual workers and away from a sort of idea that, there should be redistribution to support poorer workers. And we also know from existing data that even though there are these innovations that are happening all over the place in social protection, there is very low coverage of informal workers in both contributory and non-contributory schemes. So we know that in the absence of state support, worker organizations often provide protections on their own to their members and families. And a few years ago, we ran a study with the Federation of Informal Workers of Nigeria. They ran a very interesting cooperative for their members. And it was actually this cooperative which was really, really vital during COVID in the crisis response. It wasn't state social protection that helped out the workers. It was their own cooperative. They were able to withdraw savings interest-free. And it really helped for them to have that. The problem is that obviously these kinds of cooperatives are poorer people cross-subsidizing other poorer people. And sorry, somebody's mic is not off and it's just a little bit disturbing. Sorry about that. So there are pros to this and there are cons to this, right? What I've done here is tried to show there's a link to the case study we did on the cooperative. And in the one column, I'm trying to show you, why it works well for workers. It's great in emergencies. It's suited to their needs. It includes, for example, health protection, but also land schemes. So you can get cheap mortgages because that was a priority the workers wanted. It includes a school fee fund, which is something workers often prioritize and which are not included in traditional social security schemes. There was trust. They've built a lot of trust with the workers. They feel like they're not being taken advantage of. And this is in a context where people view the state with a lot less trust, right? And where, you have microfinance schemes asking 25% interest, where you have a micro pension scheme, isn't going to do much for you in the long run, providing benefits that you don't always prioritize, like, for the school fees and so on, and a lot of mistrust. So there is this thing that in the absence of state support, there are organizations of informal workers coming together to start organizing their own sort of worker responsive social protection schemes as well. Then in terms of production, so the IMF estimates the informal economy in Africa produces 34% of GDP, which is a significant share. At the same time, the informal economy is labeled unproductive, and I'm actually at the moment attending a conference on productivity in the informal sector. One of the issues with labeling the informal economy unproductive is that we actually don't know very much about whether the informal economy is unproductive or not, because we have very little data which actually tells us about productivity in the informal sector, especially amongst the smallest sort of workers, the most micro kinds of enterprises. Labor force surveys give us some information, but they don't give us enough information to calculate productivity. Enterprise surveys often either exclude the informal sector, or if they do include them, they are sampling biases, which mean certain types of very, very small enterprises are not sampled. And also, just calling the informal economy unproductive really takes attention away from the very real structural constraints and demand-side fluctuations that informal workers face. So, if you're saying a street vendor is unproductive, what it implies is that the street vendor just isn't putting in enough labor hours or enough time, or enough effort into producing. But actually, the main thing that is going to determine whether a street vendor is making money and is being productive is whether there is demand for their product, whether there are people coming by. So it's very hard to tell whether, that this is unproductive. It's really about whether their customers, is the market set up to draw customers, is there infrastructure for the worker, or are they having to spend all of their time making up for service failures and infrastructure gaps? So there's this issue with productivity. And part of the issue is that because these calculations around productivity don't include, they look just at sort of labor, largely labor effort is the main sort of denominator which goes into productivity calculations. They don't bring into focus any of these structural constraints, demand side constraints that informal workers are operating under. And as a result, you get policy that doesn't really speak to what's actually needed. So, I mean, what we're seeing, and this conference I'm at right now, which is in Southeast Asia, but I could say very similar things in Africa, is that what we see is these sort of formalization schemes that are a sort of mixture of registration, taxation, and residual micro business support. So very supply side support. We'll give you a bit of credit, a bit of skills training, and you must register and pay your taxes, which ignores the fact that taxes are often being paid anyway, and that you can do skills training and you can give credit, and that can help, but it's not going to be enough when you're facing these larger structural constraints around lack of demand for what it is you're selling or making, that you're being harassed by the local government on a daily basis. You have eviction campaigns to deal with. There's no water and sanitation in your workplace. So almost like there's a need to rethink formalization. And I think one of the biggest things, so this is interesting because when I think of formalization, I think this is the kind of formalization that we need to be thinking about. So this was an initiative in South Africa that we were involved in 2020. Unfortunately, it never got off the ground. But the idea was, working with the Department of Environment, Forestry, Fisheries, and the Department of Science and Innovation, was to develop participatory guidelines for the integration of waste pickers into urban solid waste management. So, organizations of waste pickers come together and they can actually be contracted into the municipality to provide recycling services. And the justification was that the waste sector, they're already contributing a lot to saving the municipality in terms of its waste management. How could we use public procurement to create demand for their services? And we've seen this happen in India. We've seen it happen all over Latin America, where local governments have procured services from cooperatives of waste pickers themselves to add recycling to the waste management services. So this was a participatory guideline. It's been published. It's out there. It's a wonderful document. Unfortunately, local governments in South Africa have chosen to privatize recycling through private companies instead, and that's displacing the waste pickers, not including them. But this, to me, is what real formalization is, right? You're formalizing them, you're bringing them into a system. They are having a say about what that system looks like, and you're doing real work to both empower and create a demand for what they're producing. And then finally on reproduction. So I mentioned this in the redistribution slide, the cost of social reproduction borne largely by women. I don't think this is controversial. I think this is well known. There's lots of time use surveys and so on have proved this. At the same time, the ability of women to redistribute some of their care work is limited. So support for care outside of the family is limited. It's still often seen as something that should be done by the family. We've been particularly concerned at WIEGO about trying to ensure that there is childcare support in informal workplaces. So increasingly, formal workplaces are recognizing that we need to provide some kind of support for care in formal workplaces. The IFC, for example, came out with guidelines around what formal sector enterprises should be providing in terms of maternity and childcare protections. But that obviously doesn't apply to informal workplaces. And so that's been a particular concern for us. And again, in the absence of state support, workers create their own solutions. So again, just some data. This was from our COVID-19 crisis study, which we did in 12 cities around the world. And this is a bit of a complicated graph, but what I like about it is it really, really shows what a care burden does to people's incomes and what it did to the ability of carers to recover their income during the COVID crisis. So, and particularly women. So let's just look at the woman on the left. You'll see that the green the green bars represent people who experienced an increase in care work during the COVID lockdowns in 2020. And the orange reflects the people who didn't experience the care increase during the lockdowns. And you'll see a huge difference. So the people who didn't experience care burden increase during the COVID lockdowns, their incomes sat at about 65% of their pre-COVID earnings. So still a substantial cut because of the restrictions and so on. But if you look at what happened to the people who experienced a care increase because of the school closures or family members being sick, you know, there you're seeing people at under 50% of their earnings prior to COVID. And what was interesting about that is that happened for the woman, but it didn't happen for the men. So even the men who experienced an increase in care burden, they didn't experience that drop in income. So there's a difference about how women and men do care, I think. But I thought that was quite an interesting piece of data picked up from COVID. And Ghana, Accra was one of the cities, Dar es Salaam was another city, and Durban in South Africa was a city. So that's 3 African cities were included in that sample. And it's just to say, again, workers coming up with their own solutions. You know, we've been working on a project to support the strengthening of an existing childcare centre in Makola Market with the Ghana Alliance of Market Associations. And one of the pieces we did was we realized that there are guidelines and standards for daycare centres in formal workplaces in Ghana, but there were no guidelines and standards for daycare centres in and around informal workplaces. So with Ghana's ECD Alliance, we developed a set of standards which was then integrated into the national ECD policy. But it's the worker organizations, GAMA in particular, which have really kept this childcare centre alive, right? So again, it's workers shouldering the burden and redistributing amongst themselves, you know, richer traders kind of paying some of the fees to make sure that, say, the kayai, the head load porters could send their children to the centre as well. So it's an interesting example. So that really was my effort to map. I'm just looking at, okay, I don't have very much time. So I'm going to try and flip the script quickly, but not too quickly. Let's see if I can do this in 5 to 10 minutes. So if that's the situation, we're seeing that informal work is actually doing what social policy should be doing in many cases because there is a gap in public provision. And it's has both negative consequences for workers, but it could also have some positive consequences, and it could teach us about how it is we could shape a more responsive social policy and a social policy that's really embedded from the ground up. Because I think that's, you know, social policy isn't just something the state comes up with. It's got to be part of social contract formation. So these were some key principles, but I can skip those. I think on the redistribution side, there's an issue here around taxation, and I think combating this discourse that the informal sector is a hidden gold mine that is not being taxed enough, which is certainly what some governments kind of see it as. Certainly, there are parts of the informal economy who are well off and should be paying tax, but we've got to disaggregate them from the own account, poor own account workers and lift the tax burden on those workers and make sure that the focus is on the high net worth individuals and the corporations. But But I think also there's an interesting issue of bringing capital back on the hook for working conditions. So particularly amongst waste pickers in both India and Argentina, there have been efforts to try and link, they might not be employees of large corporations, but they are doing work through their recycling work. They are doing work that benefits corporations and large private sector. And so there have been some interesting efforts to try and formalize those links through different pieces of legislation, not always through labor legislation, and to draw on those relationships to argue that this should finance social protection, because there's always a question of who's going to pay. If Africa is 80% informal, and there's a lot of poverty, who's going to finance all of this social policy? And I do think that we know there's a lot of tax evasion. So are there ways we could actually leverage certain sectoral relationships to finance protections and finance pieces of policy that are important? Some of my colleagues have been doing some interesting work on sort of expanding the idea of collective bargaining for self-employed workers by linking labor rights and human rights frameworks. I won't go into that. It was really interesting. My colleagues in Accra yesterday were walking around, taking someone from the British government on a tour of one of the markets, and they found something new, which was that some of the traders sell for cloth. They're actually kind of affiliated to a single cloth making company. And those traders don't pay tax because they pay their tax through that company. So in a way, they are distributors, they sole distributors for this large company. And you do have to wonder in that case whether there is some kind of responsibility this company then bears. Why is it the worker themselves having to bear all of the risk? Is there, if these people are distributing for a single company, is there not some kind of relationship there, some kind of economic relationship that could be leveraged? So that's one thing that I think we need to think more about. I think in terms of protection, there's this issue of, well, workers are building their own schemes. Or is it better for workers to build their own schemes, or is it better for the state to come in and provide social protection? And I come up against this sort of binary a lot, that it's an either or situation. And, the proponents say, well, these schemes actually reflect the reality. They provide flexibility, local relevance, trust. But then the critics will say, well, these cooperatives and these grassroots-led sort of institutions can actually entrench inequality and elite capture. They can marginalize women, sidestep accountability. They're not always trustworthy, and there's nothing to regulate them. So why are you sort of providing this second best solution in Africa? But I think one of the things we have to move beyond is that binary towards a social policy approach, where we actually look at what is being created on the ground and look at the best of what is being created on the ground and try and work out how public policy can come in to support that. And I think there's been some really interesting work, and I've listed the authors here, about really thinking how you adapt your formal policy systems to support and learn and to integrate non-state actors. Melanie Sampson, my colleague from WIEGO, spoke about the need to expand the definition of the public. And so, in the case of waste picker cooperatives being integrated into the public services, calling that co-production, sort of co-production between the waste pickers and the state to provide a service. And she looks at a set of criteria for when we can think this is a progressive integration and when it's actually a sort of downgrading of the state and letting the state off the hook, and providing second best solutions for African citizens. So it's an interesting debate that we can talk about more. I think on production, there's also some bridging to do. There is a sort of discourse, and it's a powerful discourse, that Africa's economies are not going to take off without lots of large private sector firms coming in. That this idea that Africa is going to grow through micro enterprises is wrong. And I think that there is some validity to that, absolutely. But you can have lots of large private sector enterprises coming in, and they may not prioritize people, and they may not prioritize jobs or good jobs. And we see that in the tech sector already, where there's a threat to people's jobs. So how do we think about, yes, we do need a dynamic private sector, which is creating opportunities in the formal sector, but how do we maintain what's happening in the informal economy, maintain the solutions that people are creating for themselves, and support those solutions and help them to become stronger and to earn better livelihoods and to push themselves out of poverty? And again, I think there are a set of things we can do. And one of them is about recognizing social policy as a foundation that enables informal workers and firms to take advantage of economic opportunities. So linking the social and the economic at that micro level is very important. And I also spoke about public procurement and others demand side interventions, which I think are important. I won't go into this, but it's really just about saying that we need to think across levels, macro, micro, and meso, when we're thinking about the productivity question. And then there's this the issue of reproduction, and thinking about whether we could learn from Latin America. Thinking about the idea of care systems in Latin America, there's this idea that we should be building our social policy around the idea of care systems, which include a number of measures to support that the focus of society should actually be around care, and that's what we should do. So I think one of the issues that we are picking up in Africa is around the sort of privatization of care services, the increasingly childcare, for example, the solution is being seen as childcare social enterprises. I think that is interesting because they're trying to provide flexible solutions, but I don't think it's going to provide the kind of care services that is accessible to everybody. It might serve a certain market, but it's always going to be a for-profit solution. And so we need to think about other ways that we could build childcare solutions that are going to serve everybody, including workers in the informal economy, and ensure labor rights. Because that's the other thing about the social enterprise model, is that it's producing a new class of own account workers on the continent, own account care workers who are running small care businesses. And that's, I think, what does decent work look like for them is a question. So I'm going to end off there, and I know I've run over time, but I didn't do too badly, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think we should allow the person who started presiding to continue. I will make my intervention as somebody who had listened to some of the things that have been said. And while I was preparing for this seminar, I went through a number of key issues which I think I will want to raise. So maybe Georgie or somebody who had started the program should please continue with the presiding. And my huge apologies for my mix-up.
I think Esther was chairing in your absence, Comrade John.
Please, I think she should just continue.
Okay.
Thank you, Laura, for that presentation. Esther has a cold, so she prefers not to have to preside over this. So I'm not sure why John wants somebody else to continue, but because he's here, he's the chair. What do chairs do, John?
Okay, Prof.
Thank
maybe
you.
just give a start, then I'll follow.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's in order to thank Laura for this really interesting and illuminating presentation. I was sad when she said she was running out of time, and so she had to rush over what I consider to be the most exciting part of her presentation, which is the question of building up and what workers have been doing themselves and the ways in which the state still needs to step up. But we heard quite a number of interesting insights about ways in which the state could support production, social reproduction, also redistribution and so on. So thank you for those insights. I'd like now to ask if anybody has questions that they would like to ask. I don't know if you can write your questions in the chat, because we don't see I can't see any questions yet. But if you can write questions in the chat or unmute yourselves and ask a question or raise your hand, that would be helpful so we can kickstart this conversation with Laura.
I think we have two hands up, don't
yeah,
we?
okay.
No.
We have hands up. Okay, so John, you can see them. I can't see the hands up. I don't know why.
Shall I just call them?
Yes, please.
Mom, Ben, please do. You can ask your question, and then Okpoku also have your hand after her. After Ben, then you.
Bonjour à tous. Donc, je me présente, Mouna Benotman de la Tunisie. Je suis docteur en sciences économiques. Merci Laura pour cette présentation très riche en informations. Je voulais en fait revenir sur un point, si possible de le clarifier. C'est la contribution en fait des plus vulnérables ou des plus faibles revenus dans l'impôt. Comme quoi en fait dans le secteur informel, ils pourraient payer plus d'impôts que les autres. Donc j'aimerais clarifier en fait ce point. Merci.
Okay, Okpoku, can you follow up with your question so that we can take a number of questions?
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. With regards to how, for example, the redistribution nature of the people in the informal employment, usually if I see the presentation, it was a lot like release the poor from paying taxes, the poor in the informal sector. In other words, try to get to know the upper class in the informal sector and tax them, and the poor in the informal sector, you release them from paying these taxes because this makes them regressive. But this has been going on for a long time, but we know that nothing is actually happening because, as you know, it's not as easy tax to just, because you don't know their income, you have less information about them, so it's difficult to say that these are people who can pay tax and these are those who cannot pay. So you can't. So, but in economics, there's a well-known fact that that's why in many advanced countries they usually talk of tax and transfers. So once you do tax and transfers together, whatever it is, you make it regressive and progressive in that nature, because the transfer will benefit the poor. So we've been always thinking that in our developing countries, we cannot do a good transfer policy. But I think that, for example, consumption taxes, that you know that it affects everybody. we can actually go on for a policy that support a higher consumption tax with transfers, and that will be easy to implement than what we've been talking about, that we should be taking the poor off and get the rich in the informal sector to do so. I want the speaker to speak on this thing, how this releasing the poor informal sector, how it can be done. I mean, how it can be implemented in a normal society. Thank you.
Okay. Those are the two that I can see their hands up. Maybe Laura, do you want to just address the two issues that have been raised?
I'll have a go. So on the taxation issue, I'm not saying that people in the informal economy are always paying more tax than people in the formal economy. And I'm also not saying that in absolute terms. I'm talking in relative terms. So we're talking about what people are paying as a percentage of their income, right? So you'll see that in that second slide I showed, there were some people in the lowest quintile, so the poorest workers in the informal economy. Some of them were paying 47% of their income in tax. Now, I'm not sure what the tax rates are in other African countries, but in South Africa, a 47% tax rate is usually reserved for the highest income earners in the country. So that is what I'm saying. It's not that they're paying more in absolute terms. It's that they're paying more of their income in relative terms because they are earning so little that even a small tax can be 50% of what they're earning. And so that is the point I'm trying to make, and I hope that's clearer. And of course, it's not always the case. There was huge variation in that second graph that I showed. It might be, the first graph I showed, people were paying 10% of their income, which is maybe relatively less than many people in the formal sector are paying. But it's still a substantial amount if you're on the poverty line. So I think that's the point I'm trying to make. We are asking people who are very near the poverty line or even below the poverty line to then give 10% of their income to taxation. And I think that is questionable as to whether that's the right thing to do, considering that in this case, work is really the buffer against things like poverty and food insecurity. I think that leads into what was sort of point about the taxation. So I am not, in fact, the tax expert, but we are running an interesting project in Ghana with the revenue authorities at the moment to think about how we could get real about how we exclude some of these workers from the tax net. I think one of the things I would think of immediately is that there are some occupations in the informal economy who we know are poor. So if we think of headload porters and waste pickers, what are the occupations that people are doing? We know that kaiaye in Ghana are really, really poor. So why are we making them pay daily tolls and taxes? Could we not just say this is an occupation that we don't tax? And actually, for a while, we had negotiated an exemption on taxes for kaiaye in Accra, but it's come back again. So I think that it's not impossible to develop. It's not impossible to develop ways in which we could exempt some particular groups through kind of occupations. But I agree with you. It can be challenging, and do you really want to be coming up with lists and lists and lists? But I think that there are ways that we could do it on an occupation level. I think there probably are other ways. I worry about the idea that you can just up your consumption taxes and say that the poor are going to get that back in the form of a transfer. I mean, I've seen critiques, for example, of the Ghana LEAP program, which is the the social protection transfer program for the very poor. And that was kind of a replacement for the fuel subsidies being removed. So there are many cases where fuel subsidies are removed, and in replacement for that, so fuel subsidy benefits everybody, and the replacement for that is a very, very small, very, very tiny cash transfer program, which benefits, not very many people. I know LEAP goes to not very many people at all, and it's a small, small transfer. So I guess I have a concern about increasing your consumption taxes and then saying that you're going to give that back in the form of transfers, when the value of transfers that we often see is very, very low and not necessarily enough to make up for the fact that you're now paying more in consumption taxes. So that's one issue I would raise. But I think it's certainly something we can debate. And Georgie, just to say, I agree with you that the most interesting part of the presentation was the worker-based alternatives. But I hope what I do is I'll lay the foundation here, and then I'll elaborate on those in November at the conference.
Okay. Two questions from on the chat. One is saying, thank you, Laura, for a very informative presentation. Bearing in mind that over half or 2/3 of the African population is rural area, from a social policy perspective, how is this incorporated in the work of WIEGO? And the second question, I think, is coming from Samuel, who is saying, are there comparisons with Latin American experience on informal care work as well as part of the Global South informality?
Okay, so I'll take those two questions. So Newman, we actually don't work on, we do have been our focus. Large parts, 2/3 of the African population are in rural areas. But we are also seeing rapid urbanization happening as well. And I think the big story of the informal economy has really been this idea that, we'll get this structural economic transformation. People are going to move out of agriculture. They're going to come to the cities. They're going to get waged employment in industry. And then out of that, we're going to see a services sector emerge. This is the story of how economic development happens, or the story that used to be told of how economic development would happen. But we're not seeing that happen in the cities, right? People are not moving out of agriculture into the cities and finding lots of waged employment in industry. They are finding that employment in the informal economy. And I think it's that logic which has driven WIEGO's focus on the urban informal economy more than the agricultural and more than the rural, is because we've been trying to challenge this point that, well, sort of for 30 years, we've been trying to challenge this point that this kind of structural transformation happens and that people urbanize and then they get waged employment. It clearly isn't happening. And so we have to accept that reality, and our policy frameworks have to accept that reality as well. So I would say that's one justification for why we focus on the urban informal economy. On the comparisons with the Latin American experience, I haven't seen a lot of comparisons. I mean, I think the Latin American experience is interesting for African countries to think about. I think Uruguay is the one country, and I think Argentina, before it had a big political regime change, were both countries that had adopted this idea of care systems. So they'd almost structured their social policy around care. And within that, there was healthcare, childcare, elder care, social protection. community care systems. So that was also interesting. So they also had this idea that there could be care systems that come up from the grassroots, but that there must be a public policy response to support those care systems. So I think there's something to think about what's happened in Latin America. And what's interesting as well about what's happened there is that you've had this feminist movement pushing for many, many years around this issue of care and how care should be institutionalized within the state. And there have been some regime changes, and the feminist movements have gained some political power. And this is one of the results of that. And it's quite interesting. And I'm not saying that it would transfer over to an African context at all, because they're very different contexts. But it is interesting to think about, could we think about the care services we provide and think about how they could be better integrated, better financed, whether we could think about some of this hybrid governance that goes on with care, because care is one of those areas where people need to trust the systems that they're involved with. So where cooperatives and grassroots-led initiatives are really important. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that there are comparisons, or at least learnings to be had, or a conversation to be had with the Latin American experience. But I'm not sure it's happening yet. Gosh, I think the questions are coming thick and fast now. I can't keep up. So Georgie, okay, so I'm going to try and answer the questions as they I'll answer Georgie's question in the chat. The principles behind my proposals. Yeah, I think that would be a big topic, and I'd need to give it a bit more thought. So let me answer your second question about collective bargaining for self-employed workers. How would this work for those who are genuinely self-employed as opposed to those in disguised fake employment? So I think that is a super interesting question, and it really gets to the heart of what my colleagues are trying to do, is to say collective bargaining, just to be clear, is the kind of bargaining that happens between workers and employers, where you come to a collective binding agreement about, how the employer is going to treat workers and so on. So the question of how you can do that for self-employed workers who have no employer is a really interesting one. And it actually links up to the point I was making on the slide about the waste pickers, right? I was saying that they are trying to forge an economic relationship with corporations who are profiting from their work, even if they're not in an employment relationship. And I think that's where the idea of how you could think about collective bargaining for the self-employed could work. So how it works with these waste pickers, there is this kind of law, it's an environmentally based law, it's called extended producer responsibility, and it's being adopted in more and more countries, which says that companies are responsible for the end life of their products that they produce. So if you are Coca-Cola and you are producing all of these plastic bottles, it's actually not the government's job to sort out all of your plastic bottles. It's your job as the company who is producing this to make sure that these bottles are not fouling up the environment, and are being recycled. So countries that have adopted that, and of course it is the waste pickers who are often now doing that recycling work of finding the bottles and sorting the bottles and sending them off. So the argument there is that, well, we're actually now doing work for you, Coca-Cola, or whichever large company we're doing, and we're not your employees. But we do want to engage with you collectively to bargain for a better deal and to bargain for some kind of benefits for this work we're doing that is helping you to operate. And so there's a need to think about what kind of legal framework could allow that to happen. And currently labor law doesn't allow that to happen because labor law is framed around the employer and the employee only, which is why my colleagues are trying to marry human rights principles with labor law to come up with a legal framework which says, this is how collective bargaining in the informal economy could happen for the self-employed. It is also about, and it's very sectoral, right? It's very sector specific. So, for example, that is waste picker value chains. This extended producer responsibility legislation is one line that connects these self-employed workers to capital. Home-based workers and garment chains would be another example of where, that potentially they are subcontracted disguised employment, but not always. But are there ways that they could collectively bargain with the garments, with the corporate actors in those chains? So it's a new area for experimentation, and it's part of this. It's part of this idea of getting capital on the hook again, right? Of getting the people who really have the money, because we're facing a world right now where so much of the world's resources are being located in these huge corporations, and it's getting worse and worse. I was at a workshop in Nairobi a month ago, listening to the workers in the digital economy in Kenya. These digital value chains that are being created. There's a digital company, Silicon Valley company in the US, who is outsourcing the worst of its digital work to Kenya and not to Ghana, because Kenya started regulating it, so now they've moved to Ghana. And listening to these women who are working in these digital value chains, it's the same as listening to garment workers talking about in Asia, talking about what's happening to them and their lack of power. And so somehow we have to create this link. And so I think that is it's an important frontier to think about. And people think we're a bit crazy when we talk about it, but I think it's important.
Okay, Laura, I think we have 2 or 3 more questions, one by Isaac, another by Michel, and then one in French. I wonder if you are able to see it, or I should just read them out.
Perhaps you can read them out.
Okay. Isaac is asking, could the mono-taxation system used in some of the Latin America, where informal workers receive health and pension benefits as incentive, be a viable approach in Africa to expand pension and health coverage, key aspects of social policy? Mitchell is asking, thank you, Prof, for your interesting presentation. I noticed that you gave examples from English-speaking African countries. Do you have concrete examples of redistribution through perception in terms of social policy? Otherwise, do these taxes help to implement social policies that are favorable to the most vulnerable? Maybe the interpreter.
Okay, maybe I can answer those too.
Yeah, okay.
Comrade John, is that okay?
Yeah,
I could take
please go
Isaac
ahead.
and Michelle's, maybe just do 2 at a time. So the question of the monotax system is really interesting. So again, yes, this is a Latin American innovation where you have a single payment, you have a simplified taxation regime, and a simplified health and pension regime as well. And it's a one-stop shop. The worker pays their tax, their health, and their pension contribution all in one go. And it's a system that's worked really well in places like Brazil and Uruguay, Argentina, Ecuador, to help formalize a certain group of the informal economy. And certainly it is heavily promoted by the International Labour Organization as the answer to formalizing the informal economy. So I think that it is an interesting approach. What we had noticed about 2 years ago was that nobody, although the ILO promotes this model a lot, nobody had done any study where they actually asked workers what they thought of the scheme. All of the analyses were very institutional, top-down kinds of analyses. So we did a study, and we did it in collaboration with the ILO about 2 years ago in Uruguay, really trying to get at what workers' engagements with the scheme were like, both workers who were members of the scheme and workers who were not members of the scheme. And I think one of the key things was that what is useful, and particularly for women, is when the example has the monotax scheme, but it also has the social monotax scheme, which is heavily subsidized by the state, right? And that is the one where the poorer workers tend to end up, and where women in particular have benefited from the scheme. And I think what's also good about it is it doesn't just do health and pensions. It also provides some kind of occupational benefits as well, so occupational injury benefits and stuff like that, which workers often prioritize but aren't included in general social protection schemes. So that was one of the important findings, that a simple monotax needs to be supplemented by the social monotax to reach the more vulnerable workers in the informal economy, and particularly women. And the majority of the social monotax participants in Uruguay were actually women, which is a good thing. So I do think it's a viable model. I do think, and I had heard that Senegal is potentially working to experiment with some kind of implementation of a monotax, but I could be wrong about that. I haven't heard much more. But again, it really is, the devil is going to be in the detail, right? So yes, it's a great idea, but how much are you expecting people to pay? How are you going to simplify the rates? Is there going to be any kind of subsidization? Are you going to make it really accessible to people? I think those are the questions I always ask, because it's not always, yeah, it's a great idea, but how you implement it is going to be important as well. And I think one of the issues with the monotax is it's created formalization, but it hasn't necessarily created upward mobility. So that is one of the problems with this formalization discourse as well. Okay, cool. You're going to be registered, you're going to pay your taxes, and you're going to get some social protection. That isn't necessarily going to mean you earn more. And so, but you've been formalized. But the idea of formalization is that, you know, I mean, one of the driving things about formalization is that it must improve incomes. But with the monotax schemes, that's where it stops, right? Necessarily. There are some schemes which have linked registration with the monotax to access to markets. So you can get preferential access to certain markets, for example, if you've registered with the monotax. And I think that might be a useful addition in an African context as well, because then you're adding that livelihoods component, which I think is important. On the second question, I gave some examples from English-speaking African countries. So I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but what I'm thinking is that are you asking that the taxes that are being paid by these informal workers, do they help to implement social policies that are favorable to the most vulnerable? So actually, they're paying their taxes, and maybe that's a good thing because other people will benefit. I think that's an interesting question. We do have a tool, and it's actually a question for a budget analysis, I would say. So we do have a tool called the Informal Economy Budget Analysis, which looks at it's looked at usually public expenditure. It's looked at public expenditure and where it's going. from an informal economy perspective. I think what would be interesting is to look at where revenues, so the tool itself only includes an expenditure component. It doesn't include an income component. It's not telling us where the government is getting the money from and then how it is allocating that money. It's just telling us where the money is, it just tells us on the expenditure side of what's happening. But I think it might be very interesting to try and work out to do both a revenue and an expenditure budget analysis from the perspective of the informal economy, to see what's happening. My sense, though, is that a lot of the money that is being collected in taxes and fees from some of the poorest workers in the informal economy stays with local government. And so it may finance some local government services, but it's certainly not going to sort of financing cash transfers and things like that. But certainly a fuller budget analysis would be very interesting. And I think this is a good time to do it because there's so much emphasis on fiscal policy and redistributive fiscal policy at the moment. So it might be an interesting thing to try.
Thanks, Laura. I think there's the hand of Sadia Fadimatu. Her hand is up. Sadia, are you still there? Can you ask your question or contribution? Okay. In the absence of any other person wishing to speak, let me just add to the conversation.
John, there's a question in the chat.
In the chat,
you can
okay.
read that from Eminian.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you for an informative talk. Have you come across innovative grassroots initiatives in Africa similar to India's Self-Employed Women Association?
Oh, okay.
And which organize women and advocate for their right and access to social protection?
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I will tell him.
So I'm going to answer.
We're going to be around.
Somebody's unmuted.
Yeah, I will just ask them to unmute.
Okay, great, thanks. So I think, Amy, that's a really interesting question. And yes, there are a lot of grassroots organizations in Africa that do what the Self-Employed Women's Association does. Not to the extent. So the Self-Employed Women's Association has 3 million members. It's 45, 50 years old. It's almost a government in itself in the services it provides to its members. And I would say that in the WIEGO network in Africa, we don't necessarily have something as strong as that. But there are certainly some very, very good grassroots organizations working in the informal economy. I mentioned the Federation of Informal Workers of Nigeria. They run their own cooperative. There's the Zimbabwean Chamber of Informal Economy Associations. Zambia has a very strong one as well. Ghanaian Association of Market Associations, GAMA. Lots of strong organizations in Francophone West Africa as well. So there are some very strong organizations, and there are also African trade unions who organize workers in the informal economy, and who are part of that as well, right? And so I want to acknowledge that too, and I think strengthening those organizations and helping them take the next step is something the trade unions need to play a really important role in. There was a question in French from Inde, who I wanted to answer, because I thought it was a good question, on on changing the narrative and perceptions of the informal sector. And actually, this conference that I'm at now is exactly what we've been trying to do. Yes, the informal economy makes a significant contribution to GDP. And I think it's one of the key things we've been trying to do. Sometimes we get accused of over-celebrating the informal economy, because the informal economy, the working conditions aren't great, the work is not decent work often. Why are you celebrating this? And it's not that we are celebrating a lack of decent work. What we are celebrating is the solutions people have come up with themselves. And we are saying policy needs to support these people, not see them as a problem. And far too often, I mean, in global discourse these days, the informal economy is accepted largely as a reality, and we have to work with the informal economy, not against it. But when you get to national and local government level, it's very often the case that it's seen as the problem that needs to go away. And I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done about perhaps making the economic case for the informal economy. I think that's part of the problem. I know from WIEGO's side, we've taken a very social policy heavy focus to the informal economy. And I think that's important. I think it's needed because a lot of the interventions poorer workers in the informal economy need are social policy interventions. But I do think we need to start thinking about the number crunching and saying, this is how much they contribute to GDP. Okay, we've got that already. This is what investments are needed to make this street trader more effective, to allow them to raise up the value chain. This is what it's going to cost, but this is the cost to society if you don't do that. Like, we need some hard numbers, and especially at this time where government spending is constrained and austere. And I mean, I see even UNICEF these days is reappointing a chief economist. Clearly, UNICEF has got the point that they're going to need to make the economic case for children at the moment. So I think we need to be making the economic case for workers in the informal economy a bit more strongly. And some of it's going to have to be less around human rights. And that's not saying anything about human rights, which are really important, and more about actually saying these are the economic benefits and these are the economic costs if you do not support the informal economy. So that's one way.
Thank you very much, Laura. Okay, maybe what I should do, I want to just briefly make the point that the work that WIEGO has been doing and sister organizations like StreetNet and the women organization in India, in the Asia, has been tremendous in terms of addressing organizing within this sector of the working population, which have been left on their own by the more organized trade unions. And the example that Laura has brought with respect to what is happening in Latin America and in India, I think is very helpful. And some of the things that have been done in South Africa is very helpful in terms of providing possible way forward for a number of our countries in the African continent. I was just going to make reference to the conversation, to the thing that have been done with respect to the informal sector in Nigeria. And the fact that when the Nigerian government pushed through the contributory pension scheme, I think this was in 2004, despite the opposition of the trade unions, a number of pension fund administrators came on board. And then the Pension Fund Commission, the National Pension Commission, I think after a decade or so, now develop a framework in which funds can be gotten from the informal sector. And just like the example Laura was giving about former states backed contributions and the cooperatives, which FI1 in Nigeria tried to do. And at some point, one of the pension fund administrators had the Nigeria Labour Congress, which I had worked for, as one of its key stakeholders, and had served on the board representing the trade unions of the what was called the Trust Fund Pension PFA. And they engaged me to try to talk to the informal sector, FI1 and the other organizations to try to see how the Trust Fund Pension PFA, which had connections with the trade unions, could assist in making getting contribution from the informal sector. And we tried to do this with the leadership of FI1. And one of the challenges we saw, as you rightly indicated, was that the workers didn't think they should contribute their small earning to a big state regulated sector that they are not sure when they need this money immediately they can get access to it. I think this is one of the reasons why the cooperative, which the informal sector workers control themselves, has been much more successful in this part of the world. But and the point about taxation, I agree with you completely that people in the informal sector across our African continent pay much more tax relative to their earning than the multinational corporations and a number of our indigenous capital enterprises. I think most of our countries, the only people that pay real tax are the public sector workers, because our work in the Just Tax Justice Federation have shown how the multinational corporations have become very adept at not paying taxes at all, and how they subvert every effort by the state to collect proper taxes from them. So the need for us as organized labor, the formal organized labor now, to work with the informal sector to protect them from the constant rates which municipal authorities engage, the constant extortion which the municipal authorities at all levels engage or extort from the informal sector is imperative. And if we are going to, as a class of working people, say we are speaking on behalf of the working people of our respective countries and of the African continent, then we have to address how to engage people who represent 70–80% of the workforce in a number of our countries that right now are only peripherally represented by the unions, because the organized trade unions, because of the complexity of the various sectors of the informal sector, are not too keen to go into the type of organizing which will bring even 20–30% of this large population in the into the former trade union sector. A final comment I want to make is to also agree that, even though since 2015, the ILO, through recommendation 204, had come about a framework for formalizing the informal sector. This is not likely going to happen, and that is not going to be a route towards consolidating the industrialization of our countries within the African continent, because all over the world, we've had big state actors being responsible for making the type of industrial progress that have been made towards the overall development of our respective countries, of their respective countries. And but the example that have been given with respect to Latin America and Asia is very important, because the work that you people are doing, organizing the pickers and other several sectors of the informal sector, is huge and important work that needs to be done. I just thought I should just add this to the very wonderful presentation which you did. Thank you.
Thanks, comrade. Thanks, Comrade John. And lovely to have those words from you. Such a respected member of the trade union movement as well, and one we've had a long relationship with.
Thanks. So where do we go from here? Esther doesn't want to talk. Yogi.
Chair, so we've also run out of time. So I
great.
suppose it's time for you to end the meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Laura, maybe you should have the last words?
Yes, just a huge thank you for this invite and time to talk about the informal economy. And yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get to spend enough time on the second half, but I'm looking forward to engaging later in the year at the GETSPA conference and talking more there about the solutions we're seeing.
Okay.
Frameworks
I
we
want
can
to
use
thank
think about that.
our interpreters. Usually, we normally run out of time, and we're very happy that they bore with us, that we've taken a bit of their time. And we want to thank everybody for being part of this conversation. And we do hope that subsequently we will get more information. We should get in touch with WIEGO and to try to get more information on the presentation and to keep the very good work they are doing to go forward. Thank you all for being part of this webinar. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks,
Bye.
Laura. Thanks, Chair. Thank you so much.
Au revoir.